I was 1/3 of the court. Now I think it's just Justice Kagan. And yet the number of Jewish justices is out of proportion to our percentage of the population, and Jewish justices have played a very influential role on the Supreme Court. So looking at the role of Jews on the Supreme Court both gives us a great picture into American history, into legal history, and also into Jewish history, in the history of anti-Semitism, and also gives us a little bit of light about kind of what's going on today in terms of the Supreme Court and conflict, because all of that, a lot of the first contentious hearing for a Supreme Court justice was Louis Brandeis. And now we have contentious hearings constantly, but that wasn't the norm until really in the modern period, until Robert Bork. But the one exception was Louis Brandeis, and we're going to get to that and why. But I want to start by kind of talking about the general kind of buildup before Justice. So Justice Brandeis was appointed in 1916. So let me bring us up to 1916 to begin the class. So in the 19th century, there were basically most of the most prominent Jews in government were appointed to diplomatic posts. There were no Jewish cabinet officials. The first Jewish cabinet official was in the 20th century under President Taft. That was Oscar Strauss. Strauss family, the brother of Isidor Strauss, who was killed on the Titanic, Macy's family. He was the first Jewish cabinet official. But in the 19th century, there were no Jews in the cabinet, very few high-ranking Jews. The highest-ranking Jews were generally though appointed to diplomatic posts because they were fundraisers. And so like August Belmont, who was ambassador to Turkey. So Jews generally were not very prominent in public life, more behind the scenes. There was an exception, and this is something that's quite interesting. Louis Brandeis was not the first Jew nominated to the Supreme Court. Anybody, for an extra bonus special, anybody know who was the first Jewish person nominated to the Supreme Court? Do we have any history buffs or Jeopardy champions in our group? I don't think Eugene is here. So if Eugene were here, he would know the answer. We know that. Anybody know? One of the most fascinating people in American Jewish history, a man by the name of Judah Benjamin. Who's heard of Judah Benjamin? Okay, so most of you, oh, interesting. Okay, yeah. So Judah Benjamin was the first Jewish person nominated to the Supreme Court, but he turned down the nomination. Now, why did he turn down the nomination? Well, that's an interesting question. He probably turned down the nomination because it would mean a serious pay cut. Seriously, he had a plantation to sustain with, he had probably at least 100 slaves. And he was also a senator, a very prominent senator from Louisiana, and he was making a lot of money as a lawyer. He was probably one of the highest paid lawyers in the country because he was a very good lawyer. And he didn't want to give up that practice. So he turned it down. But let me tell you, Judah Benjamin is like just a fascinating historical figure. He's born in the West Indies, like Alexander Hamilton. In fact, there's some interesting connections that the families might have been related to each other, but it's uncertain. He comes to Charleston, South Carolina as a kid. He is admitted to Yale University when he's 15 years old. He's the top of his class at Yale. But suddenly, during his sophomore year, he's expelled for no reason, or no reason is given. And it's like a mystery why he's expelled. There are several scholars now who believe that he was gay and he might have been expelled for some sort of homosexual incident. but it was never revealed. It's very, and the reason there's a lot of speculation he was gay is that he was married, but it was essentially a marriage where he lived in America and his wife and daughter lived in Paris, and he saw them once every couple of years. And he had an intensely close relationship with Jefferson Davis. So he becomes this, even though he's kicked out of Yale, he becomes he gets a law degree. He becomes an immensely successful lawyer, writes textbooks on law in New Orleans. He marries this Catholic woman who is from a very prominent New Orleans family. They have one daughter, and then she moves immediately to Paris and lives there, and he just sends her money. But he operates as a lawyer, is immensely successful, is elected a senator, is immensely successful as a senator and a spokesman, and then joins the South when secession. He ultimately becomes Secretary of State of the Confederacy. He's Jefferson Davis's closest advisor. But a very pro-slavery, very everything, bad guy in many regards. Then when the war ends, he escapes. He's probably the highest ranking Confederate official to escape. He is able to make his way to London, where basically he has no money, but he starts a law practice and ultimately becomes one of the most prominent lawyers in all of Britain, and writes a textbook on contract law that's still studied today. I mean, talk about the cat with 9 lives. He was, just extraordinary in that way. There's a recent biography of him from 2 or 3 years ago that's very interesting. But Judah Benjamin, that's sort of a sidetrack. Judah Benjamin was the first Jewish person nominated to the Supreme Court. He turns it down. Now, by the turn of the 20th century, there are several successful and well-known Jewish lawyers, but still not even a appeals court judge who's Jewish. Does anybody know, this is almost an impossible question, but does anybody know who the first Jewish appeals court judge is? Chicagoan, Julian Mack. He was appointed to the appeals court, federal appeals court, by President Taft. President Taft had a very close relationship with the Jewish community because he was friendly with Isaac Mayer Wise. Julian Mack was an appeals court judge. He was also the first Jewish member of the Harvard Board of Overseers. And then he taught at the University of Chicago Law School. But really, this all happened in the 19th century. But ultimately, Louis Brandeis became the first Supreme Court justice for a couple of reasons. So first is Louis Brandeis, let me just give a little bio. Louis Brandeis is born in Louisville, Kentucky, of all places. How did he end up in Louisville? Well, his family was originally from Prague. They were originally from Prague, and they were a fairly wealthy, well-known, successful family in Prague. His grandparents actually, Louis Brandeis's his great-grandparents were part of a movement known as the Frankist movement, which they were followers of Sabbatai Tzvi, the false messiah. But ultimately, that all died out. But certain families sort of were part of that camp, and his family came from that group, and they were generally more sort of the upper class of Central European Jews. But they were also very liberal politically. And when there was a series of liberal revolutions across Central Europe in 1848, and most of them failed. So after that, Brandeis's family, along with his soon-to-be wife's family, his wife was his second cousin, Alice Goldmark. So they were all part of this milieu of sort of kind of upper class, very intellectual, German-leaning. Although they weren't German, they were sort of Central European. They moved to the United States. And Brandeis's father was a grain trader. So it made sense for him to be near the Ohio River in Louisville and kind of centrally located in the country. And he was successful. He was sort of a prosperous merchant. So Brandeis grew up in a very successful home, zero Judaism. His family, basically, most of the Frankists, the followers of Jacob Frank, essentially had abandoned Judaism. They hadn't converted to another religion, but Brandeis grows up not Christian, but not anything really. But he has an uncle named Louis Dembitz. And Dembitz was from that same milieu, but Dembitz became like a return to orthodoxy. And Louis Brandeis loved his uncle, and they were close. And his uncle was one of the founders of the conservative movement. And essentially, he had a positive connection to Judaism through his uncle, even though he didn't really practice it. But Brandeis, his father's business ended up having a hard time after the Civil War. He lost government contracts and things like that. And so the family essentially took a 3-year sabbatical where they went to Europe and lived in Europe for 3 years. And Brandeis went to high school / college. He didn't really, it was sort of in Europe at a traditional, very intense German school. And then they came back and Brandeis was accepted at Harvard Law School. He was the only Jewish person in his class. I don't think he was the first Jew at Harvard Law School, but he was the only Jew in his class. And he ended up getting the highest grade point average in Harvard Law School history. So up until that, I think the legend is that Felix Frankfurter got a higher. We'll get to Frankfurter in a next session. So Brandeis graduates, and he couldn't participate in his graduation because he was only 20. He had to wait another year to actually participate in the graduation ceremony. They had some rule where you had to be 21. So Brandeis graduates with great honors from Harvard Law School. And he ultimately forms a partnership with the number 2 person in the class, whose name was Samuel Warren. Warren was Warren was essentially from a very prominent Boston Brahmin family who owned paper mills. And through their connection, they created the law firm Warren and Brandeis. Warren's name came first because he was the source of all their business. Warren's family was their first client. And Brandeis and Warren became an enormously successful law firm very quickly because of sort of Warren was a brilliant lawyer too, and he had a very interesting life. And then of course Brandeis. And so the law firm was quite successful and was also, it actually still exists today. It has a different name. It's called Nutter McClellan, which is a very prominent big corporate Boston firm. My mother-in-law actually worked there for a couple of years when she finished law school. So, it still exists. But when Brandeis and Warren started it, and it was immediately successful. And essentially, Brandeis was a highly successful, probably in today's terms, making several $1 million a year as a lawyer. What then happened is he essentially became more interested in public service issues. And so this is around the turn of the century. So this is around 1900. There's all these huge monopolies. There's railroad monopolies, life insurance monopolies, all kinds of stuff. And Brandeis says this is not fair. They're determining prices without free competition. They're violating people's privacy. He and Sam Warren wrote one of the most famous articles called about privacy in the Harvard Law Review about people's right to privacy. So Brandeis starts taking on a lot of these causes so he essentially becomes a pro bono lawyer. He's still making a salary from his law firm because he brings in a lot of business, I presume. But he essentially devotes most of his time to public service issues. And he's a polarizing figure. there are a lot of people. See, it's interesting. There are a lot of people. He represented big corporate interests, when he was building up his firm, and then suddenly he's against those same corporate interests as a public service lawyer. And so some of his earlier friends turned on him, and they didn't, they actively opposed him. So Brandeis starts to become a polarizing figure, but a very effective figure. And he becomes associated with the progressive movement, with people like Harper's Magazine, Norman Hopgood, the New Republic, these groups that are kind of, that expose the meat packing industry, that expose the life insurance industry. And he becomes this very prominent voice in public life in addition to being a lawyer. And I'm going to return to that in a second, but I do want to talk a little bit about anti-Semitism. Brandeis does experience anti-Semitism. Now, for the early part of his life, there really isn't much. I mean, he's essentially an assimilated family. The South, this could be a topic for another. In the South, Jews didn't experience much anti-Semitism. Why is that? Because the hatred was reserved for Blacks. I mean, it's sad, but that's how it was. Essentially, Jews, although there was some, I mean, I was saying it's not 100%. You have Atlanta, you have the Jacob Frank case and so forth. But in general, Jews were accepted within Southern society in a different way than in the Northeast. And so Brandeis didn't experience much anti-Semitism. However, there is some. His partner, Sam Warren marries somebody later who is from another Boston Brahmin family. And Brandeis is not invited to the wedding, even though they were best friends, and is never invited to a social event at their house because she does not like Jews. And so he's sort of essentially excluded from that society. And the story of Sam Warren is very interesting. He ultimately committed suicide in 1910 because he had 5 brothers who inherited the paper mill business, and his other brothers accused him of hoarding the money. And I don't know if he was guilty or not, but he ultimately killed himself. There's a whole book written about it in the 1990s about that family. It's a very, very interesting family history. But anyways, so Brandeis is sort of excluded from that Boston Brahmin society. He's also the president of Harvard. Lawrence Lowell implements quotas, and Brandeis is essentially not permitted to kind of lecture and recruit students and so forth for his law firm. There's just this general, really, it sort of starts in the 1890s. It's an interesting, that period, there's this growth of this sort of establishment anti-Semitism. So the Boston Brahmin crowd, the Henry Cabot Lodge, even Ralph Waldo Emerson didn't have nice things to say about Jews. Brandeis is sort of excluded from that circle. However, it's not total, because there's also some countervailing evidence. First of all, in this, I did not know this. This was a very interesting thing I found while researching this. In 1891, there was the Boston Social Register was published with its listing of 8,000 proper Bostonians. Louis Brandeis was the only Jew included. Isn't that interesting? I bet they probably didn't know he was Jewish. There are things written about him where people didn't know he was Jewish. Now we know the name Brandeis, and so, but Brandeis University, but possible. So, and he's excluded from certain clubs, but he's accepted at other exclusive clubs. So Brandeis sort of operates in this very interesting kind of middle ground. He's both of the establishment, but also because of his Jewishness and because of his progressive politics, he's sort of outside the establishment. But then something very interesting happens. In 1910, Brandeis is introduced to a man by the name of Jacob de Haas. Jacob de Haas is the editor of the Boston Jewish Advocate newspaper. And Jacob de Haas interviews Brandeis at Brandeis's summer home on Cape Cod. He's done well for himself. He's up at Cape Cod. And in this interview, de Haas mentions that he knew Brandeis's uncle, Louis Dembens, and says Louis Dembens was a noble Jew and he was a proud supporter of the Zionist movement. And Brandeis says, I didn't know he was a Zionist supporter. Tell me more. And so they have this interview turns into a day-long conversation. And essentially, Brandeis has kind of a semi-conversion experience. He becomes a very devout Zionist. And he begins raising money for the Zionist movement. He begins speaking. He probably had never been in a synagogue before, but he starts speaking at synagogues, speaking at fundraising events, and he's immensely successful. And he is brilliant, strategic, focused. I mean, and he becomes probably the most influential Zionist in America within a couple of years. And what he does too is he connects his progressivism with his Zionism. Now, today, as we've talked about in other classes, the progressive movement is almost anti-Zionist. You know, this is a sad situation where we are right now. But Brandeis believed that the Zionist movement is going to reflect some of the greatest American progressive ideals. You know, equality, returning to the land, treating people, not there being these elites and the non-elites. It's sort of a kind of rugged egalitarianism, sense of morality. And so Brandeis becomes a leader of the Zionist movement and deeply connected with his progressivism. And he develops close friendships and so forth. And in particular, and this is quite relevant to his becoming a Supreme Court justice, in about 1911, 1912, he becomes very close with Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson is running for president and is a long shot. He's, when he announces his candidacy in early 1912, he is not predicted to win. President Taft is running for re-election, and Taft had a lot of Jewish support. However, a couple of things happen. First, Teddy Roosevelt gets involved in the race. So there are people who draw votes away from Taft to go to Teddy Roosevelt, who has a new political party. And then Taft opposes the Russian czarist. The czar in Russia had imposed a travel restriction on Jews in Russia. So if you were an American Jew traveling in Russia, you could be arrested. And there was a group of American Jews led by Louis Marshall who said we should abrogate our treaty with Russia until they rescind this order. And President Taft wouldn't support rescinding that treaty. Woodrow Wilson did. And so a big chunk of the Jewish vote moved. This is actually quite interesting in American political history. This is when the Jewish vote really shifted towards Democrats. It's really shifted during FDR's term. But this shift from Taft to Woodrow Wilson was the first big shift, because Taft had generally been pretty pro-Jewish. He had Jewish members of his. He was appointed the first Jewish appeals court judge, first Jewish cabinet official, but he did not support abrogating this treaty. So Woodrow Wilson and Brandeis become very close. Brandeis helps write the platform that Woodrow Wilson campaigns on. Brandeis is a close, informal advisor to Wilson, both strategically and politically. And then Wilson wins. So Brandeis is in this position where he essentially has a good deal of influence on the country. However, Wilson and probably Brandeis didn't want, there's speculation that Wilson was going to appoint Brandeis the first Jewish attorney general. but he doesn't. And people speculate that Brandeis didn't really want it. And also that Wilson's closest advisor was a man named Colonel Edward House, who was anti-Semitic. There's no question that he was anti-Semitic. He did not like Jews. He believed some of the old, basically sort of the stereotype things about Jews. And also, this is interesting. I said Brandeis was a polarizing figure. Some of the major donors to Wilson, who were corporate people that Brandeis took on in Massachusetts, begged Wilson not to appoint Brandeis to the cabinet. And they succeed. So some of Brandeis's old conflicts came back to haunt him. Anyways, he's not appointed, but he remains this very close and formal advisor, and he remains a proud Zionist, and he remains sort of an important public figure. I mean, he speaks all over the country. He's kind of a champion for the people. He writes books. I have a couple of them in my office. But then in 1916, there's a Supreme Court vacancy. And Wilson is 8 months from re-election. And there is a lot of discussion. Who is he going to pick? And at this point, Wilson had got a little more spine, so he's not afraid of upsetting his advisor, Colonel House. And he is even more impressed with Brandeis. And so there is, and plus, on the other side, he's running for re-election and he wants to keep the Jewish vote. He doesn't want to lose the Jewish vote that he gained. Remember, there are way more Jews now in the United States than there were 20 years ago. Remember, this is a period where there's massive immigration. So the Jewish vote is more important than ever. And so Wilson decides to appoint Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court. And then all hell breaks loose. Okay, Marilyn, please. Hey, you're still muted.
It's one of the most contentious hearings in the court.
Yeah.
There's another, I don't know what the other is, but I know this was really known in American history as one of the most contentious hearings. And the other thing is that Taft didn't want Brandeis, not because he was a Jew and anti-Semitic, but he thought he was a socialist.
Yeah. Yes. Brandeis had a reputation for being ultra liberal, although he wasn't ultra liberal in the sense that we think of it now. First of all, Brandeis interestingly opposed women's suffrage until about 1910. So he ultimately came on board, but he was also a very strong proponent of free trade, which has been liberal, but today is often kind of goes back and forth. But Brandeis in general was tended to be on the more progressive side. Now that put the other most prominent, so Brandeis is probably the most prominent Jewish lawyer in America by 1910. But there's one other person who may be competing with him for that title. Anyone know who that person is? And that person was much more Jewishly involved than Brandeis. Louis Marshall. Now, I don't know, is Gail Goldstein here? Okay. So Gail's daughter is married to the great-grandson of Louis Marshall. So, he actually, his family has remained Jewish. Brandeis's family, by the way, his descendants, half are Jewish, half are Christian. And we can get to that later. But Louis Marshall was a New York lawyer, prominent law firm. Originally, Louis Marshall was originally from Syracuse. and he grew up Orthodox. So he had a much more thorough Jewish background than Brandeis. But like Brandeis, he was an utterly brilliant lawyer. And he moves from Syracuse to New York, is a partner at a major firm. But he's involved with Republican politics. And he is, very, very much, part of that party, even though one of his law partners is a very prominent Democrat. But Louis Marshall is a highly respected lawyer. And he's also the president of Temple Emmanuel in New York. He's the one who pushed Temple Emmanuel to buy its beautiful building that's now on Fifth Avenue, which is, an unbelievable location. And he is involved in fundraising and, goes to synagogue every week. So he's different from Brandeis in that. But like Brandeis, he's a very successful lawyer. He actually helped found the NAACP. He represented Leo Frank in Atlanta when Leo Frank was accused of murdering, and then Leo Frank is lynched. So Louis Marshall, there were many people, including Jacob Schiff, who was the richest Jew in America then, and was a close friend of Louis Marshall, who believed Louis Marshall should have been appointed to the Supreme Court. And in 1910, President Taft almost appointed Louis Marshall, but he didn't there were a variety of reasons we don't need to get into. But Louis Marshall and Louis Brandeis actually knew each other. I don't know how well, it's kind of unclear. They didn't really like each other, not surprising. But in 1910, there was a major garment worker strike in New York, where the garment workers said they weren't being paid enough. They were being locked in. There was the triangle shirt fire years before that. That's I can't remember. Maybe that came after that. I can't remember. But it was all the same sort of general time in which these workers were suffering. I mean, and Brandeis felt for them. And see, the thing was, the workers were Jews from Eastern Europe, mostly immigrants, spoke Yiddish, poor. The owners were German Jews, rich, successful, didn't really have much to do with them. And then during the strike, the owners brought in Louis Marshall and the workers brought in Louis Brandeis to figure something out. Because Louis Marshall is a very interesting person. While he was of that sort of elite German Jewish group, he was also much more Jewish than the other one. He had a sympathy. He was respected and admired by Eastern European immigrants because he truly felt his Judaism, and he cared. He wasn't just someone who wrote checks, he cared. So Louis Marshall and Louis Brandeis ultimately work out an agreement that brought the garment strikers back to work. But that moment for Louis Brandeis was sort of another Jewish awakening, whereas his discussion with Jacob de Haas about his uncle was one. Working with Eastern European immigrants, he said they have a strong sense of morality, a strong sense of justice, and it really kind of cemented his feeling of Jewishness. But again, he's on the progressive side here. He's much more sort of the progressive group, whereas Louis Marshall is the traditional group. And by the way, that same tension plays out. The American Jewish Committee, we all know that exists today. The American Jewish Committee was founded by Louis Marshall and a few other German Jews. The American Jewish Congress was founded by Louis Brandeis and a whole bunch of Eastern European Jews. So this tension is a force in American Jewish life at that time. Yes, Sarah, go ahead. Unmute. Yeah.
I have a quick question. These quotas that were introduced at Harvard and the Boston Brahmin exclusion of Jews and such, do you think that was partly because of this big influx of Eastern European Jews in the 1880s and 90s?
Oh, yeah. Oh, for sure. Yes.
In response to the immigration.
Some of it, for sure. Some of it's in response to immigration, right? German Jews had assimilated very heavily. And there were also not that many of them. So in a sense, it was, there was a kind of tolerance in some ways, and general feeling that, well, this group is American enough and have adapted to American ways. When this massive migration of Jews from Eastern Europe who kind of didn't speak English, they're not as, they may need some public assistance, although there isn't public assistance back then, but they're a little bit different than we expect. And there were just many, many more of them. So for sure, but it's not, and plus, there's just a whole bunch of, the culture's changing. America is becoming a much more diverse country because it's not just Jewish immigrants, it's Irish, Italian, German, so the whole nature of the country is changing, and that's creating more prejudice. Yeah.
Because the German Jews were not Yiddish speakers either. And then all these people came from Eastern Europe that were Yiddish speakers and kept speaking Yiddish to some degree while they were here.
Yeah. Although most of them ultimately learned English. But yeah, they were different, and that definitely contributed to anti-Semitism. And yeah, anti-Semitism really. So anti-Semitism comes in phases in America. There's not much anti-Semitism really until this period. There's always here and there, but in general, Jews were pretty well integrated because there weren't that many of them. B, America sort of has this sort of rough and tumble equality, but then it increases in the 1880s, 1890s, and then really peaks in the 1930s, and then declines after World War II. It declines, then shoots up again in the 2000s, like we're having right now. So anyways, so 1916, President Wilson doesn't consult his closest advisors either, because he was afraid maybe they would dissuade him. But he appoints Brandeis, or he announces that he's appointing Brandeis. And people are shocked. His closest advisors are shocked because, they know it's going to be controversial. And then the hearings, essentially, the newspaper headlines the day after was Jew picked for Supreme Court. So immediately the attention was on his Jewishness. And, there's a hearing. And at that time in history, the nominee did not testify for himself. The nominee was in the background. So this was how it was done, then sort of the opposite of today, where the nominee's grilled. So one of Brandeis's law partners, Edward McClellan, represents Brandeis essentially before the Judiciary Committee. So he packs up this McClellan, moves to DC, and essentially spends a month answering questions about Brandeis. And ultimately, after all this, they talk about that he's too radical, that he's too rich, stuff about him being too rich and his money, essentially all the sort of kind of arguments you would expect. And it's the most contentious hearing that there's ever been for Supreme Court. But he is approved. Now, I learned something very interesting. There's a reason certain senators who did not like Brandeis still voted for him, including Senator Henry Cabot Lodge from Massachusetts. Now, why would Senator Lodge vote for Brandeis, whom he really despised? In 1913, the law, I don't know which amendment it is, but senators used to be just chosen by the state legislature. That's how it's originally in the Constitution. In 1913, the law changes that senators are elected by popular vote, just like representatives. Henry Cabot Lodge in 1916 is going to be engaged in his first election. There are a decent number of Jews and Catholics in Boston, especially Catholics, but a decent number of Jews in Massachusetts generally. If Senator Lodge votes against the first Jewish nominee to the Supreme Court, how do you think those Jews are going to vote in a tight election? And so Lodge votes to support Brandeis. And Lodge wins his first election by a very narrow margin. So it turned out to be a smart move for him. But that probably affected how others voted as well. So Brandeis kind of benefits from this fact that senators are now popularly elected. And when Brandeis joins the Supreme Court, he's the first Jewish member, obviously. And he is even then the most liberal member. Oliver Wendell Holmes is the other one, So Oliver Wendell Holmes they had been friends for a long time. And generally they walk to court together. They both live about 9-10 blocks from the Supreme Court, and they would walk together. And Brandeis becomes a very important justice pretty quickly, because he, along with Oliver Wendell Holmes, frequently dissent from the mainstream opinion. And Brandeis dissents from opinions generally in support allowing a law to exist. He doesn't believe essentially in judicial activism, that if a legislature passes a law, it serves some purpose. And as long as the purpose is clear and has good logic on its side, he supports it. So one thing that he's famous for is what's called the Brandeis Brief, where in his opinions, he would, let's say, for example, and I believe this was an actual opinion, child labor laws. So there were child labor laws first passed under, I think, Woodrow Wilson. Maybe it was the president after Wilson. And there were Supreme Court judges who opposed these child labor laws. So there's nothing in the Constitution, businesses can have children work as much as they want. It's, free country, so forth. Brandeis, in his opinion, pointed out all these studies that indicate how harmful child labor can be and how dangerous, and how cutting child labor really wouldn't hurt businesses. So essentially, Brandeis is doing sociological research for his opinions, which was unheard of. People didn't do that before Brandeis. People would simply say, the Constitution says this, the Constitution, and this interpretation says this. Brandeis would actually go and look at the facts. He was more pragmatic, not theoretical, and that was different. Brandeis also starts to hire clerks from Harvard Law School. So there had never been a Jewish Supreme Court clerk until Brandeis hired the first one. And Brandeis becomes an important voice on the Supreme Court. Some of the interesting cases I was going through. Many of Brandeis's dissenting opinions, especially regarding the First Amendment right to free speech and the Fourth Amendment right to privacy, were destined in later years to become the law of the land. So Brandeis is dissenting. During World War I, there were a lot of restrictions on speech because of the war and fears of sedition and treachery and so forth. And a lot of these laws were challenged. And many of them were upheld by the Supreme Court, but Brandeis would dissent. He was a major free speech champion. And so Brandeis begins to sort of assert his influence on the Supreme Court. Questions? I need to take a sip of water. Anyone have any questions? Sue, did you have your hand up? No. Any questions? Okay. So what about Brandeis' Zionism? What happens there? Well, this is also quite interesting. So Brandeis is on the Supreme Court, but he also remains an important figure in the Zionist movement. You know, he's still a major fundraiser, major speaker. And Brandeis, essentially through his personality and charisma and writing, had really built up the American Zionist movement and had made it respectable. Remember, many German Jews did not support the Zionist movement because it was seen as being anti-American. You can't have dual loyalties. You're either loyal to America or loyal to Israel. You can't do both. Here's the most prominent Jew in America, so clearly an American Jew, but who's also a strong supporter of Zionism. And so Brandeis essentially gives the Zionist movement great credibility. And he also recruits a new class of leaders to the Zionist movement, including Stephen Wise, Rabbi Stephen Wise. New biography of him just appeared. I just got it. Felix Frankfurter, and we'll get to Frankfurter later. A lot of prominent American Jews become Zionists, and Brandeis is sort of their leader. And he argues, using his skills, he says it's not. Zionism isn't inconsistent with Americanism. It's very consistent with it. In fact, if you want to be a better American, you should be a Zionist, because Israel represents the best of American values. It's building essentially democracy in the Middle East. And Jewish values and American values are consistent with one another. So Brandeis puts forth his argument. He's very successful in it. And essentially during World War I, while Europe is enmeshed in war, Brandeis is not only the leader of American Zionism, he's essentially the leader of the worldwide Zionism, because he's the biggest fundraiser. He's the person who's sort of seen as that guy. But then World War I ends, and Chaim Weizmann is essentially the most important Zionist figure in Europe. David Ben-Gurion is already in Israel. Chaim Weizmann helps Britain in the war as a chemist. And when the war ends, we know that there's the famous Balfour Declaration. Chaim Weizmann helped get the Balfour Declaration passed in Europe, or issued. And Brandeis, behind the scenes, helped Woodrow Wilson, come to support the Balfour Declaration. Again, Colonel Edward House, the anti-Semite, who's Wilson's closest advisor, opposed Wilson supporting the Balfour Declaration, but Brandeis helped make it happen. But then something really interesting happens. And this is part of, we see conflict among Jews today, AIPAC and J Street and so forth. That's nothing new. This has always happened. So in 1921 or 1920, the American Zionist movement brings Chaim Weizmann to come speak in America to fundraise and so forth. Chaim Weizmann hates Brandeis, despises him. Why? Well, to people like Weizmann, so it's hard to know somebody's personality without meeting them, but I would suspect that Brandeis was not the most warm and fuzzy person. I think he was a little aloof. I think he was probably a little arrogant, just from my readings. He was not an easygoing guy. Brilliant, charismatic in a certain way, but not someone you want to have a beer with, just not that kind of guy. Okay. So Weizmann thinks of Brandeis essentially as a Gentile. This is how he looks at Brandeis and says, this is somebody who doesn't have a sense of Judaism in his kishkis. Because even though Weizmann is lives in Britain and sort of part of British high society, Weizmann grew up in the shtetl. Weizmann grew up Orthodox. Weizmann grew up speaking Yiddish. He's sort of the land, of the people. And he looks to Brandeis and he thinks Brandeis brings this kind of arrogance, and he's not really one of us. And so essentially, Weizmann forces Brandeis out of the movement. And because Weizmann really still, even though he's still the most influential because he's been involved. And he says, look, 15 years ago, Brandeis didn't even admit to being Jewish. He's probably kind of what he said. And now he thinks he's the king of the Jews. So this is kind of probably the logic that Weitzman used. He said, this guy thinks he's in charge of all of us. And so Brandeis and his whole group are essentially exiled from the mainstream Zionist movement. And Brandeis, though, remains supportive. He, gives financially, and he's sort of a behind-the-scenes person, but he's really not involved at all in organized Jewish life after 1920, which is very interesting. His daughter, Brandeis's daughter, I think he has 2 daughters. One of them does marry somebody. No, he has 3 daughters. 2 of them marry Christians, and 1 marries somebody Jewish. And so there's part of Brandeis's family that's still Jewish. But one of his daughters marries Rauschenbusch, who was the son of the most prominent Christian theologian of the time, Walter Rauschenbusch. Walter Rauschenbusch essentially creates the Christian social gospel movement, and his son marries Louis Brandeis's daughter. And so that part of the family is liberal Christian. And in fact, I know one of their descendants. His name is Paul Rauschenbusch, and he is the head of an organization called the Interfaith something in New York. But he was the editor of the Huffington Post religion section when I was a writer for them. I was a writer for the Huffington Post religious section for a period of time. Now it's sort of basically dead. But so that part of Brandeis's family is Christian. The other part is Jewish. And Brandeis essentially withdraws from Jewish life publicly after his falling out with Weitzman. But interestingly, in his writings, he becomes more and more of a kind of, we would today say, a right-wing Zionist. Over time, he actually supports the group around Vladimir Jabotinsky. He helps them in the 1930s, early 1940s. And he also remains a very close advisor. He was very close with FDR. He helps FDR. Supreme Court justices did things then that they would never do now. He would meet privately with Roosevelt and help him draft laws and give him advice on lobbying certain senators and Congress people. He was, even though he was a Supreme Court justice, he was also a kind of informal advisor to FDR. And many of the people who worked as part of the New Deal were Harvard Law School people that Brandeis had. One of his clerks was Dean Acheson, who becomes the Secretary of State after World War II. So many of Brandeis's clerks go on to become prominent figures in the Roosevelt administration. So Brandeis remains extremely engaged with Jewish life and becomes an immensely influential Supreme Court justice. And then, of course, we all know the university is ultimately named for him. It comes after he died. The university was first going to be named for Albert Einstein, but Einstein said no, and then they chose Brandeis. So we're out of time, but we covered Brandeis pretty well. Next week, we're going to get to Justice Cardozo, another very interesting, very different from Brandeis, very different, but equally interesting history. So I will see all of you next week.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Very interesting.
Thank you. Very good.
If you have any questions, bring them.
Okay.